So I'd like to talk to you for a few minutes about two ideas that I think are essential tools in Equiano's arsenal as he critiques slavery, and in particular transatlantic slavery. But before we get into that, it's worth pausing for a second to think about his birthplace controversy. Was he born in South Carolina, which certain written records seem to suggest, or was he born in Africa, as he maintains in his narrative? To some degree, it's a really important question because it raises issues about his credibility. But on another level, as the authors of our anthology suggest, it really doesn't make a difference because either way, Equiano's narrative works both on a personal level and on a larger cultural level. He's making claims about his own life experience, but he sees those as representative of the larger horrors of slavery and the impact that slavery had on literally millions of Africans. As our anthology notes, we know of at least 1 million Africans who were brought to the Americas just in the 20 years from 1840 to 1860. 1740 to 1760. We also know that by the time the Civil War breaks out in America, there are 4 million slaves living in the United States. So we're not talking about something that was a minor cultural racial problem. This is a disaster, right? A human disaster that impacts the lives of millions of human beings. And Equiano powerfully attacks slavery as a moral atrocity by invoking the language of Christian idealism. And I want you to look for that language as you read Equiano's text. By Christian idealism, we're talking about things like Old and New Testament moral and ethical standards. Allusions to biblical narratives, allusions to Christ's teachings and the teachings of the New Testament as the standards by which we should judge how whites were treating blacks as human beings, and how that didn't work, how that doesn't make sense in a Christian context. How if we apply the principles of Christianity to what was happening in the slave trade, we have to see it as an abomination. So Equiano is taking the white Anglo-European world's own moral criteria, holding it up to them like a mirror. The second moral system that Equiano is going to invoke is democratic idealism. And this, rather than using God or the Bible as the source of moral ethical judgment, this grounds itself in Enlightenment ideals of human dignity and freedom. Human dignity, freedom, and potential. The Enlightenment exaltation of human reasoning, the human capacity to grow, the human capacity to create and know. And we saw in Franklin that this generates during the colonial era and the revolutionary era and the first decades of the new republic a very powerful search and desire for civic virtue, classical republican virtue, and that alternative narrative of American democracy that has its own set of ideals that are related to Christianity but apart from any belief in a particular religious sect or set of beliefs. And if the Bible and the New Testament are the framework for Christian idealism, then we can see documents like the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution as models of democratic idealism in American culture. I think it's really important that as we read Equiano and Occam and other authors who are going to be coming down the line for us soon, that we remember not to let the founders off the hook. You'll often hear historians, even college professors, who will say it's anachronistic to apply the moral repudiation of slavery to the founding fathers and their era. Certainly it's true that a majority of Americans were brutal in their attitudes about Native Americans and blacks, were willing to embrace chattel slavery, were willing to displace and dispossess Native Americans and engage in genocidal actions against both groups. There's no doubt that there was majority support for that. However, it's also true, as Equiano documents so powerfully, that a counter-narrative was on the table. You can go all the way back, right, for us to Cabeza de Vaca, Bartolomé de las Casas, who we haven't read, but was another early Spanish denouncer of the abuse of Native Americans, all the way through here to Equiano and many of the writers that we're going to encounter over the next 2 or 3 weeks. There is a growing intellectual, religious, and democratic philosophical case being made against slavery. And the founding fathers knew of it. In fact, slavery was a cause of contention and debate at the Constitutional Convention and when the Declaration of Independence was created. So we can't give them a pass. We can't say they didn't know slavery was problematic. They did. They did. And they basically compromised and decided to accept a structure for freedom that they hoped that one day would unravel slavery. But even that we have to be realistic about, given that many of the founding fathers who are our heroes were also slave owners. So tapping into these early narratives where we hear voices of Native Americans and African Americans and early Spanish colonizers and early English colonizers questioning some of the dynamics of race in America is important to putting the racial debates that we're still in American culture into a larger context. So I hope you'll enjoy Equiano, and I hope you'll use these ideas of democratic idealism and Christian idealism as leverage points, access points to understanding his narrative. See you in Blackboard.